And then I learned about the Nikola Badger, which looks even cooler than the Ford Raptor.
Taking 10% of the market by 2040, is that right?
That's our goal. Yep. The concept we have is just oxygen's everywhere on Earth. Why not just take that oxygen, put it in the fuel deposit, which is also a pressure vessel?
Is it possible to create a continuous source of green, clean, and affordable energy from deep Earth? This is episode 4 of Crownsman Energy, and today we are joined by Grant Strem. He is the chairman and CEO of Proton Technologies. He is here to discuss their patented technology, the global hydrogen market, and the opportunities for the Canadian energy sector. But before we get started, let's thank our sponsors. We are sponsored by Lamson International. Lamson International is a third-generation, family-owned and operated heavy lift and heavy haul construction company, with branch offices located throughout North America, Canada, and Australia. Lamson International offers conventional crane rental, heavy transportation, project engineering, and customized rigging, steel, and timber mat rental, as well as marine and manufacturing services. They were founded in 1946 by Neil and Billy Jane Lamson. The company is in their 73rd year of doing business. You can visit them at lamsoncrane.com. We're also sponsored by PowerZone. When you need a specialized team of world-class engineers for your oil and gas, pipelines, dewatering, or any fluid handling needs, you want to visit powerzone.com. In addition to their inventory of rebuilt pumps, motors, engines, they also have an amazing team to design and engineer your systems, no matter the challenge, no matter the location. Get in the zone with PowerZone. Visit them at powerzone.com. Now, let's get on with episode 4 of Crownsman Energy.
Hello, welcome to Crownsman Energy. I'm your host, Jared Downey. Today on the show, we have Grant Strem. He is the chairman and CEO of Proton Technologies. And Proton is doing some very is an understatement, actually, some fascinating work with extracting hydrotechnologies from the ground level. So, Grant, thanks for coming on the show. It's good to have you. I'm pretty excited to bring in this technology. I didn't know much about it, so it's going to be fun.
Jared, I'm happy to be here and talk about all the transformative clean energy things that are happening now. Thanks for inviting me.
Well, let's just jump right into it. Let's just talk a little bit about the shift that people in industry is making towards carbon-free fuels. Can you just touch on that, just to give us that summary?
Yeah, I guess in general, there's been a broad recognition that there's a significant amount of detrimental effects associated with burning hydrocarbons. Of course, air pollution that kills millions of people per year. That's something that is not often enough discussed when there are actually several paths to eradicating that economically. It's quite strange that we're still in the dark ages, and as it were. And the other thing, of course, people are worried about climate change and unprecedented levels of CO2 in the atmosphere. And whether it's the precautionary principle or whether it's modeling, a lot of people are politically very concerned about the net effect of all of this CO2 in the atmosphere. So I think this sets the scene quite well for hydrogen technology, in various hydrogen technologies to have a rapid expansion in the coming years. And that is most commonly discussed in the form of renewables to electrolysis, solar and wind to essentially electrocute water until it breaks apart from H2O. You get the H2 out of it. Every time that's done, a lot of energy is needed if you break a water molecule. So our process is a high temperature reaction, also common. The most common worldwide is steam methane reforming. And we simply do a very similar process to steam methane reforming, only we do it all underground. So the ground is our reaction vessel. We don't have to transport all the fuel to some other location to oxidize it. We just put the oxygen straight into the fuel source. And it's all trapped under a strong cap rock, and that in that way everything gets contained. Then we have a way to keep everything except for hydrogen in the ground. It's essentially a hydrogen filter, and the only thing that can dissolve through it is pure hydrogen. So this unlocks a big clean energy trajectory. There's many technologies that are already very mature. Fuel cell technology, all the ammonia, all these end uses are already there. Storage, handling, transport, these problems are solved and getting better and cheaper. But what the missing link is in all of this, I think, is the low cost, clean hydrogen. So when you can buy it cheaper than natural gas, base load power gets attractive, clean transportation fuel gets attractive. It all comes down to the dollar.
And you've made, I mean, Proton's made some real steps, and we're going to get into the the nitty gritty of that. But I want to just circle back quickly to something. There's obviously an appetite for it, but there's also a government push, and I don't want to just talk about Canada or U.S., but even globally. I mean, there's a real push to lower CO2 emissions. And can you just outline? Of course, there's a lot of conversation about it, but just from your perspective, working in the industry you are, to sort of give us that perspective of the market.
Sure. Well, basically, as most everyone in oil and gas knows, oil and gas is hydrocarbon molecules, hydrogen and carbon primarily. And then there's lots of H2O, water in there. So if you think about that H2O and that hydrocarbon, there's a lot of hydrogen trapped in a very energy dense pressure vessel already. So I guess governments are starting to recognize this. There's talk of blue hydrogen increasing in scope, usually in the context of carbon capture and storage, but that still has quite a bit of emissions. If you want to go to zero emissions, you have to use something like our process, or solar and wind, or geothermal, or in BC hydroelectricity towards electrolysis. So there are many paths to getting to this clean, green hydrogen. I think the cost structure that we have is advantaged, but there are many ways to do it economically and competitively. I've sometimes said that the transition from whale oil to kerosene didn't happen because everyone loves whales. There were no government mandates. It was basically consumers saying, if we can buy lamp oil less expensively, we will. And so I think that's why this new revolution towards hydrogen is going to be something that blossoms and blooms and continues to crescendo across many years to come. This transition is inevitable.
Right. And, in a lot of countries, I mean, there are some countries right now, I mean, they're committed to it. I mean, I think it's Japan. I mean, they've put real commitment both on the private side, but even at a government level. I mean, they're going full scale on it. And there's some other countries I think you've mentioned before to me, as Australia is another one. And so from what I mean, obviously you're watching the market and you're seeing some of those countries, the investment that they're putting in, right?
Yeah, globally, I'd say I get the most phone calls from Australia. A close second would be Germany. I was on the phone earlier this morning with Norway. There are some sectors of the economy globally that have understood that this is the path, and they're all in. Basically, they're pushing all their chips on the table and saying it's hydrogen and hydrogen derived fuels, and it's clean. So there's definitely a strong push. I think many of these countries are much further ahead. For example, in Canada, it's pretty unusual to find a hydrogen fueling station.
Right. Yeah.
If you're in Germany, you've got 80 or 90 fueling stations, and there's a roadmap to build out 600 or something. So if you need to do a road trip to go see your grandma across the other side of Germany or something, obviously you don't worry about fuel availability. In Canada, we have one big highway, and we still don't even have hydrogen fueling stations along our number one highway. So there's a lot of low-hanging fruit in Canada. I think that there are studies coming out. BC pushed out a great one recently. Alberta is working on one. There is some government awareness of this, but I would suggest that we are perhaps 5 years behind, and we have to, if we want to be a dominant player, policy, not necessarily investment, but government policy is a very important consideration in incentivizing private investment in this direction.
Right. Yeah, it's, I wanted to, so I want to go into I want to circle back to some of where, later on, I do want to touch on some of the products that are actually out on the market. But going back to Proton, first, I think it's worth noting, anybody watching this, to get the goal that Proton, I mean, your goal is not a small one by any measure. So let's talk about the goal, and then let's talk about the technology itself, a step by step of how you're actually extracting the hydrogen.
Sure. Proton Technologies Canada has a goal to provide 10% of the world's energy needs in 2040, which is about 20% of today's energy needs, because growing populations and increase in energy demand. So anyway, 10% of the world's energy production in 2040, Canada's got it. We have enormous resources that we can unlock at low cost to be clean energy. It's just a pivot from thinking about burning hydrocarbons, and having all these tailpipe emissions right within cities where they cause dementia, inflammatory disorders, cancers. All of that can be eradicated, and the associated costs. But even beyond our local needs for electricity and for transport fuel, we can be a massive exporter based on the resources that Canada has. I published something on LinkedIn a while ago that suggested that based on the one oil field in northern Alberta, 2 trillion barrels of oil, we could supply approximately 700 years of Canada's electricity demand, assuming nothing else contributed. If we switched off all other sources, that one oil field can supply 700 years of electricity for Canada. So that's the type of scale we're talking about. And of course, there's lots of other resources within Canada. That's the biggest that I'm aware of. But
yeah, I wanted to clarify that. I wanted to clarify that one, Grant, because when you say that, now, is that because your system, which we're going to get into in a second, but is that because your system is going to utilize active oil fields and oil reserves that have already been discovered? So we're not talking about an exploration undertaking. We're talking about just simply not simply, but the extraction process as opposed to the exploration. Is that right?
Yes. So essentially, my early career, I was in oil and gas from the start of my career. Burlington Resources, I was an explorationist. And one of the lessons for me, or big takeaways that influenced me, was understanding the size of the resource pyramid. So if you think about the resources of the world as a pyramid, whether it's in mining or energy resources or what have you, there's high grade stuff and there's lower and lower grade stuff that's technology or high prices can unlock lower and lower grade stuff, resources. So in the case of oil and gas, it's really truly hard to fathom how much oil and gas is out there if you look at the whole pyramid. It's really, really mind-boggling. But in our history up till today, we've only touched the stuff that's pretty easy to get. You poke a hole in the ground and it flows at you. And then eventually you think, oh, if I push water down this well, it'll drag some oil along and bring it up. And then you think, oh, maybe I should inject some steam and see how that works. Oh, we get better oil recovery. There's these different processes, polymer floods, and different ways, horizontal drilling, fracturing the rocks. There's lots of different ways to unlock different, basically get deeper down into this pyramid. But I would suggest we've still only scratched that. We're limited by drilling costs. We're limited by it's an internationally competitive commodity, but it's enormous. And Canada is scratched deeper into that pyramid than many places. And I would suggest that Canada and any mature basin is actually not that mature if you think about what is possible technologically and versus the scrappier resources. So it's really easy in the subsurface. It's relatively easy in the subsurface to move gases around. So if you inject oxygen, they can go find an unswept oil molecule. It's pretty hard to take a big viscous oil molecule and get it to a production wellbore. So when oil fields are abandoned, it means they've reached the end of their productive economic life. But it doesn't mean it's out of oil. There's still huge amounts. It's just been depressurized, and now they can't figure out how to attract that or push that oil molecule to the wellbore. So when oil fields get abandoned, there's an enormous amount of fuel still in the ground. And it's easy for the oxygen to find those oil molecules, and much easier still for the hydrogen molecules to get to your production wellbore. But so repurposing these oil fields, like the potential that this suggests and unlocks is something that is not well appreciated. I definitely have been a lot more popular on social media lately. We get a lot of requests of how do we buy shares and all that type of thing, because it really is a process that can shake up the existing system's cost structure for energy, clean energy. So
Well, I think this would be a good time to actually go into what Proton is doing, though, from a step by step. And there's going to be people that watch a show that you're going to see a couple graphs that we bring up on the screen, and they're going to get it. But there's going to be a huge portion, myself included, that really don't have a clear understanding of the technology that you're using, which is actually a lot of it is existing technology and existing infrastructure. So could you just walk us through the step? You've got a great video. We'll put a link to that in as well. But can you walk us through the steps and the technology that Proton is actually using for this process?
Sure, Jared. First, I'll just talk about the existing system for transport fuel. Right now, we spend a lot on trying to find resources. A lot of it's been found, but there's still, you have to define it closely. There's a footprint to seismic lines. There's a disturbance that happens to go out and find new resources, however it's done. And then you drill expensive, energy-intensive test wells. And then once you do have a discovery, you have a pretty significant challenge in trying to transport that liquid fuel to some sort of place where you can refine it into a different chemical makeup. So usually that's done by pipelines and trucks, and you end up getting this, and rail cars from Canada, and you end up getting this significant distance traversed to a refinery that uses fairly carbon intensive hydrogen to make changes to that, and then boom, you've got diesel and gasoline. So great, now we have something that's compatible with a certain engine type, and so we have to transport that at significant expense to some retail situation, just so we can put it in a tank and eventually combine it with oxygen. So all an engine does is oxidize these liquid fuels, and it releases a lot of energy and gives us the drive that we need. So by contrast, if you just leave that fuel in the ground, and there are known fuel deposits, unswept oil, like you can never corner the market on lousy oil fields because they are everywhere. That resource pyramid, I'm not kidding, don't even try. It's like bottomless almost. Well, maybe. Anyway, so the concept we have is just oxygen's everywhere on Earth. Why not just take that oxygen, put it in the fuel deposit, which is also a pressure vessel, and react it? That first reaction is called oxidation. It causes gasification reactions, which release some carbon monoxide and some hydrogen. And then there's another further step, water gas shift. Is a reaction where you take carbon monoxide plus water that's in the resource, and it forms hydrogen and carbon dioxide. The carbon dioxide is trapped under a geological seal that's already proven itself for millions and millions of years. And now you have, and of course you do caprock studies that are appropriate to whatever pressure you intend, but usually you operate less than the original reservoir pressure, so you're not worried about leaks or things like that. And a lot of that CO2 will precipitate as carbonate rock, and above a certain pressure, a lot of it will become a supercritical fluid. It's geologically trapped, and there's a long industrial history of carbon capture and storage, or carbon sequestration. Anyway, projects like this where oxygen has gone into a reservoir, there's been more than 500 of them worldwide. They all make hydrogen. So it's not in question whether that's possible. It's just tweaking the geometry of your wells and trying to make the system more efficient at giving you hydrogen with the least thermal losses and things like that. Not that there's a lot of thermal losses. The Earth is actually a pretty good thermos. So once you have the hydrogen established and you're making hydrogen in this oil field, you put down in one of your wells at the high point of the reservoir, because hydrogen is buoyant and floats up toward the high point of the reservoir. You put this membrane in, or some sort of a filter, a hydrogen filter, which we've demonstrated at our field site. We put these at the bottom, at the high point of the reservoir and at the bottom of the well, and this pulls only hydrogen to surface. So the concept I'm trying to propose is leave the carbon in the ground. So I think we can achieve that. We can achieve that, and it's something that's I think revolutionary in its cost structure. So we're limited by how fast we can get oxygen into the ground. So building lots of large, low-cost air separation units is going to be important. These will proliferate all over the place once we build our first very large-scale demo. And yeah, I think it's something that most people, Proton, well, it's increasingly on the radar of the hydrogen technical people, and it's also definitely arriving on the radar of the investment community.
So where is it now? Where's Proton at now? Because I've gone through the video, you see the technology. Anybody who's watching this, please go and take a look. But because it's very interesting. But you've actually got, you've put boots on the ground for this. So can you talk about where you're at? I know you've got a facility in Saskatchewan, and can you just walk us through that part?
Yeah, gladly. So we had the good fortune of finding a more or less pre-built facility. We are making some changes. The process was intended to produce more oil, and it was built by Petrobank in 2011 at a cost of $250 million, and their process was called toe-to-heel air injection. So we have these big air compressors, good geological characterization of the reservoir. There's lots of infrastructure and approvals already in place. So we just walked in. We were fortunate that somebody else had the misfortune of going out of business. The oil returns weren't as hoped for. And, at the time this was built, the oil price was much higher. And anyway, for a variety of factors, we ended up with it. And we're quite happy to be doing our hydrogen demo there. So we have separated pure hydrogen from mixed gas. This summer, we're hoping to do a demo where we turn on all the equipment that we have on site and end up demonstrating 30-ish tons of hydrogen per day, which, that's not the final picture. It's a step along the path. For our process to reach its zenith, we actually need an oxygen plant. Right now, when you inject air, 80% of what goes in the hole is nitrogen, and nitrogen will not form carbonate rocks. It will not go into a supercritical state. It just essentially builds up quickly, and you end up with pressure challenges, which means that if you're just injecting air, you actually have to have a vent. And if you have some sort of a pressure relief valve, that means you have emissions. So by contrast, if you inject only oxygen, then you can have a zero emissions process. And that's our goal, to have this entire thing a clean energy process.
Which is it's a pretty amazing thing, because really and I know batteries kind of work hand in hand. There's a component of battery power. Let's say if you put a hydrogen vehicle, there'll be batteries involved. But even batteries, they're quite to extract the materials needed for batteries is a very it's not a very green energy friendly system. So really what you're doing is you're trying to develop just at the extraction level, you're trying to make it a green process as well, right?
Yes, yeah, and we'll power the whole thing with a portion of the hydrogen that we create. So the whole thing's an emissions-free process. I think in terms of transportation, when you have a hydrogen fuel cell vehicle, a battery, a much smaller battery, but a battery is a component of that electric drivetrain. So that will continue to be needed. Just, for example, if you build a gigafactory that can make 500,000 cars a year, if you need 8 times less battery per car because you install a fuel cell and a hydrogen tank, you can end up making 4 million cars per year for the same number of batteries. Perhaps, maybe that's an
Right.
approximate ratio. But it's something that, batteries will be part of the system going forward, especially in smaller vehicles and electric bikes and these various other small aircraft. But I think that if you're going long distances, heavy haul, all that sort of stuff, there's definitely an advantage towards hydrogen. And that basically comes down to within hydrogen fuel cell systems, you store more electrons per kilogram in the hydrogen than you can in lithium ion.
Right.
So it's, you can go a lot further. I think that, eventually a lot of these battery vehicles are going to, for trucks that are hauling things, they'll have drop tanks that fit in the back full of a hydrogen and a fuel cell that power the battery truck. And, there's going to be a lot of different solutions that are found. But at the large scale infrastructure, trains, planes, and big rigs and ships, hydrogen and hydrogen related fuels, that clean energy trajectory will save them a lot of money and make things more efficient.
Yeah. And I think we touched on earlier, but I think we should also clarify. I mean, we don't have a lot of hydrogen vehicles, semi trucks going down the highways right now, or but in places like Europe and that, it's very common, right? I mean, this is not something new. The end user product of hydrogen vehicles, that's not a new thing by any stretch.
No, it's definitely, becoming, it's been, I guess, tested out in many countries for many years, and it's been growing, and there's been advances in cost, improvements in, precious metals per fuel cell. Everything is getting more and more efficient. And as this gets mass produced and economies of scale, it's cheaper. There's less parts, in a vehicle that doesn't have internal combustion. It's also, according to Toyota, safer. So, there's a whole bunch of different reasons why, I think it's an inevitability. There's some models that are going to come up. I like battery cars, but I also think that it's not the solution where everyone on the block can have one. There's not enough electrical power. There's a last mile challenge where when communities are built, the substation's a certain size, and they weren't predicting everyone to have an electric vehicle. So if every other house, for example, has a hydrogen car, when you plug in your hydrogen car or hydrogen pickup truck, it powers your house. And, you can use blockchain to figure out how much your neighbor who's drawing from your electrical load can pay you. Or when you pull up to your employer and plug in your car, you're powering your employer's business. So there's lots of blockchain opportunities in that regard. But it's part of the solution, a big part of the solution going forward, specifically in Canada. A lot of Canadians aren't even aware that we have a mandate that in 2025, 10% of sold vehicles will be zero emissions. So, we can't do that all with batteries. Hydrogen has to be a part of that. And even the efficiency, hydrocarbon molecules, most of the mass, most of the friction is contributed by carbon. Nobody really wants that. It's just something that glues the hydrogen together until it can be combusted in an engine somewhere. If you can avoid carbon entirely, you can save so much on all that mass, all that pumping power, all these challenges, no risk of spills and leaks across the landscape. There's so many reasons why there's a significant advantage economically and environmentally that it's, these other countries that have proven the model and they're all ramping up their ambitions with hydrogen will be the roadmap for us. So Canada, if you're in Saskatchewan or Alberta, there's no fueling stations yet that I'm aware of. And so it won't be long until consumer demand. You look around and watch all these people saving money. They can fill up their pickup truck for $5 or $6 on hydrogen instead of $100 on diesel or gasoline. It doesn't take long until demand requires it.
Right. And I wanted to go to another part is just on that big industrial level is coal plants. They're actually one of the easier things to convert from coal power to hydropower, or not hydrogen power.
Exactly. I think that most of these projects, the financings at large scale will get backstopped by baseload electricity. So if you go to, for example, a coal plant, there's a burner with coal dust that's always burning and a separate loop for steam. So it doesn't really matter what your fuel is. And coal plants are particularly easy to convert to hydrogen, assuming you have a vast low cost source of hydrogen. So those will be the first to be converted, and also a mixture of hydrogen into existing natural gas turbines. Some of them can do pure hydrogen. A lot of them can do, well, all of them can do some amount, whether it's 40% or 80%, depends on the unit. But you can feed hydrogen into a natural gas stream and make baseload electricity. So that's another way to make pretty significant offsets. I'll point out, we do still need oil. Everybody likes rubber in their shoes or plastic in their headphones. And, there's asphalt in the pavement that we all enjoy. There's lots of hydrocarbon products that will always be needed and actually continue to increase in demand. But just burning the stuff, I think this is going to be a footnote of history where 50 years from now, we look back and say, it's amazing that great grandpa just burned that stuff, kind of analogous to steam locomotives that burned coal. They're interesting in history museums, and muscle
Right.
cars will always be interesting in history museums, and hopefully my garage too. But, it's something that will be a curiosity of history as opposed to a common thing.
Yeah, where do you think so Proton is, I mean, they're doing it at the extraction level, so they're essentially storing it, and then they'll clarify if I'm wrong. They'll basically plug into an existing export system through a natural gas line or something like that to export it to market. Is that right?
Yeah, the huge existing infrastructure is pipelines and power lines. So if we can make electricity by burning hydrogen through existing assets, great. Repurpose that to clean energy, and the owner makes more money. Everybody's happy, and of course, carbon tax benefits if there are carbon taxes in that location. But yeah, those, you can go 10 or 15% hydrogen mixed into any natural gas system worldwide without causing problems, unless you have some weird, you're using it for another purpose than just strictly burning it. You can definitely do that. So that offsets a lot of carbon that way by adding joules of energy of hydrogen. But then, as this gets built out, there's going to be an increase in demand for hydrogen as a transportation fuel. And there are
Hmm.
test communities around the world. Germany's got a couple. I heard of one in England. They're around where they're doing full communities built on just pure hydrogen supply. I've actually even heard of a concept for that happening in Alberta. I'm not sure where they're at. That's a rumor, but I salute whoever's up to. I won't mention anything proprietary, but there are things happening in this big push towards hydrogen for whatever we're using to burn as hydrocarbons today.
So where do you think the gap is, though, Grant? When I mean, I did a fair amount of research, and so it's obvious there's a market. I mean, there's companies, buses. Ballard makes they make buses that are running off hydrogen. I don't know if I'm saying it right. Nikola Motor Company. Yeah, they make semis. I think those semis, those are in full production, right? Like you can actually order those,
You can order
right?
them. They're just starting to ramp up, first in Germany and then in Arizona where they have their factory. So today's their Go Public Day, so it's a big day for them. But anyways, I think that I'll use them as an example. Ballard's great too. They're ramping up fuel cells in very efficient ways and selling them internationally. I think very few in Canada, which is unfortunate. But there's this Nikola, for example, can make solar to electrolysis and get hydrogen cheaper per gigajoule than diesel. They've got an order book of $14 billion worth of trucks. And, to try and suggest that there won't be demand destruction for Canadian heavy oil and bitumen is absurd. It really is absurd. It'll always be needed for for asphalt and certain products. But there's no getting around the fact that entire fleets change out if they can save 1 or 2%. So it's the Walmarts,
Yeah.
it's the Amazons, it's all of these kinds of guys who go, oh, we can save 20 or 30% if we switch to fuel cell vehicles and have no emissions. You know,
Right.
well, it's the story that story kind of writes itself. If people can save a buck, they will. They do. So they're off to the races, and they're one example of many. Volvo has hydrogen fuel cell big rigs coming on, and they're all tooling up for like extremely high scale manufacturing. And it's worth pointing out that most of Canada's exported oil today gets turned into diesel in the United States. But if those guys are all switching to fuel cell big rigs across the next 5 years ish, you know, what's going to happen to the demand for Canadian crude? It's worth wondering. So
Where do you think the gap is going to come? Like, or that the pitfall, the challenge that's going to, any industry. I mean, you look at Tesla. I mean, we want to have battery cars. Okay, great. Where are you going to charge them? Well, we're going to put batteries. We're going to put charging stations all over the place. I mean, just unbelievable. It's actually unbelievable what they've done. Where is the hang up going to be? With hydrogen-powered vehicles. You talked about the coal plants. Okay, so you repurpose those. So that's a major infrastructure. So getting the hydrogen to that location, or through power lines or what have you. But on the consumer level, where would the pitfall be, do you think?
well, I think it mostly comes down to education and adoption. So the technology's there, and people can today, pre-order these things. So it's not common for people to have hydrogen fuel cell pickup trucks, but they're going to start being available, before, in the not too distant future. I'm an F-350 guy by history, and I like Ford trucks. I think they're great. But I also put a deposit on a Cybertruck, and then I learned about the Nikola Badger, which looks even cooler than the Ford Raptor in terms of all of its specs and its zero emissions. And once I'm done with making low-cost hydrogen, I think I can fuel it up for like $5. And even our field guys are going to be running around, in oil fields in hydrogen vehicles, because I want us to save money. So it's education and adoption are the main things. There are some policy guidelines that could be helpful.
Right.
Yeah, but in general, it's the dollar that drives it all.
I want to just, before we wrap up the interview, I do want to, I've seen, so I went on your LinkedIn, seeing some of the companies. Just give us some background, just for you personally, how you got from point A to point B. I mean, you're taking 10% of the market by 2040. Is that right?
That's our goal. Yep.
That's ambitious. And I want to understand what the process, your background, education, partnering with people to get here, even other companies you've worked for. What led you to here to Proton?
Well, I guess I've always had a curiosity in science. My dad was doing experiments in physics in our basement when I was growing up. And so I was always sort of intrigued by all this, brought to the Kennedy Space Center as a young boy, and that left a strong impression about interest in science, and eventually ended up doing a geology degree. I wanted to be a hydrogeologist, couldn't find a job, and took one with an oil company, summer job, and then ended up quite enjoying it, always thinking how can I improve things from the inside. I was never a big fan of the oil industry, and I'm still not a huge fan of the oil industry, but I think it's been hugely helpful in advancing, the world towards having predictable and abundant energy, which helps so many things. But there's, I guess the different pieces of it, the geology side, the engineering side, understanding the constraints and the problems, especially on the business side. So I was a reserves evaluator for a while, and then worked picking stock price targets for oil sands companies for a while. And that sort of gave me an idea of how it's all done today. So I could see a lot of the shortfalls and the opportunities of how it should be done in the next step. And watching technology stories evolve how the investment flows, even within oil and gas. Well, this is kind of I won't say the endpoint, because there's always something to eclipse every technology that's come before. If somebody can do fusion power to make hydrogen more economic than proton can, great. I will buy shares in that one at that point. But this is the lowest cost structure energy resource that I know of, and so I couldn't not do this, because I think there's a philanthropic burden to it as well. We've got this idea, we've got this place to do it. Why not save millions of lives per year and clean up this planet a lot? To me, that's
without taking away production, without taking away the good economics for the world. I think that's one thing where people will lose me sometimes, where it's like, well, we're not going back to wagons. It's not happening. So let's not have that discussion. Let's figure it out. And I found it, what really struck me is you're using existing infrastructure in place and then adding the technology. And of course, you said about the idea. Where did the idea itself come from? I mean, where did it all actually start?
In Northwest Calgary, Denny's. So one of my old professors, who I stayed friends with for forever after, Dr. Ian Gates, and I were having I think it was a 6 a.m. breakfast, and just chatting about various challenges in oil and gas. We have lots of these creative discussions, and it came down to, he mentioned a paper that he saw where one of these air injection projects or oxygen injection projects had a quite high rate of hydrogen. And that was interesting. I said, if we could find a way to, put a filter in that only let hydrogen to surface, that's a clean energy business. And we did a big prior art search and couldn't find anything. So this is a well-known phenomenon that hydrogen is a byproduct. They used to have explosions in California during World War II. It's 100-year-old technology. Oil fields can make hydrogen, but and then all the safety standards came in the 50s, and everything sort of has improved from there. But with the various stovepipe activities, it's never made its way into the limelight for whatever reason. It's not in prior art. This should have been done 80 years ago. Anyway, the idea was just, let's hire a couple law firms, do a prior art search, and if it's not there, let's patent it. So we did, and co-founded Proton together. And it's been a fun and interesting journey ever since, hitting the milestones in de-risking and demonstrating and quantifying along the way. But the main thing is, the concept is, I think, pretty obvious. You've got an enormous, essentially unlimited fuel supply and an unlimited supply of oxidizer. There's a lot of energy that you can bring to bear, right? So it just comes down to how inexpensive can you get that oxygen into the reservoir.
Right. Well, Grant, I mean, thanks for coming on the show. I think it's one of these things where I think we've caught you at one point, and I think a year from now, 2 years from now, I think we'll have to have you back on to go, okay, well, where are we at now? Because, I mean, it's obviously now you're getting ready. I think you said you're hoping this summer to scale up that Saskatchewan location. Is that right? To do some more heavy production. Is that right?
Yeah, we're going to be, right now, all of our wells are pulling from the bottom of the reservoir, where you'd expect, because hydrogen is buoyant or the least dense gas, you'd expect the lowest concentration down there. So we're going to drill a well to the high point, 35 or so meters above our current production wells. And we're expecting much higher concentrations of hydrogen. And we'd like to basically turn on all our equipment and see what sort of hydrogen flow rates we can demonstrate. So the difference between the two helps us quantify density stratification and allows us to have more comfort in investing into several enormous oxygen plants. So anyway, that's on the docket for the next few months.
Where can people go to follow along with you and see the work that you're doing? Just get more information. Is your website a good place to visit?
Yeah, that's a good place. Proton.energy. And if you have a specific curiosity that is not addressed by our website, you can email info@proton.energy. and we'll be
Okay.
happy to respond.
Yeah. Well, I know for me, I'll certainly be following along and hopefully get you back on the show as you've developed more. And I think it's like you said. I don't think it's like one of those things. It's not if, it's just when. It's going to be completely mainstream. Although, like you're saying, around the world there are a lot of investments already being made into it, and hopefully Canada will be following suit, doing the kind of things that Proton is doing. So thank you for coming on the show, Grant. I really do appreciate it. And I hope our questions weren't too hard.
No, it's my pleasure, Jared. And I hope your viewers enjoyed it as well.
Yes, thank you. Okay, everybody, thank you for watching. Again, thanks to Grant for coming on. I mean, when we're doing this energy show, we want to cover all different angles of energy. It's so important. We're trying to educate people. We're pretty unashamedly also promoting these companies that are pushing hard for change, to innovate from all sectors. So really do appreciate Grant coming on and representing Proton and walking us through that process. Hope you subscribe, join, keep following. And thank you again for watching, everybody. We'll see you on the next episode of Crownsman Energy.
Thank you for watching. Remember to subscribe to our YouTube channel, follow us on Facebook and LinkedIn. If you would like to help support the production of the show, head on over to crownsman.com/donations. We have 2 ways of supporting: the $5 monthly subscription option and the support heavy industry one-time donation. Again, that's crownsman.com/donations. Thank you so much for your support, and we will see you on the next episode.